Welcome to the dark world of scary stories. A place where every sound is a premonition of the unknown, and every shadow is a step into another dimension. If you're ready to open the door to the scariest secrets, subscribe to the channel and don't forget to hit the bell, because the scariest is yet to come. Turn on the light and let's begin. Devourer of the Abyss. Curse of the Bermuda Triangle. The dark abyss of the Bermuda Triangle has always lured ships, planes, and people like a hungry predator waiting for its prey in the endless waters of the ocean. Disappearances have occurred here for centuries, and none of those who vanished in this cursed place ever returned. Or at least never returned the same as they were. In 1953, the great merchant ship Gloria set sail from Miami to Havana, loaded with gold and valuable artifacts. The crew was experienced. The captain, old sailor George Wells, did not believe in the tales of the Triangle's curse. But as soon as the ship entered the infamous waters, something began to happen. The first to disappear was young sailor Billy. He simply vanished into thin air in broad daylight. His screams were heard, but he was never found. Then something large and dark rose from the depths, and the sea around the ship began to boil. Crew members started hearing voices, quiet whispers asking for help, or calling them to join. The ship lost its course, and the compasses spun endlessly. Radio communication was cut off. And then, a moment of terror. Darkness enveloped Gloria, and it vanished from the surface as though it had never existed. When Captain Wells regained consciousness, he found himself lying on a strange shore. The sand was black, the sky blood-red. The wreckage of Gloria lay nearby, and standing around him were people. But these were not his sailors. Their faces were gaunt, their eyes empty, and their bodies were covered in ancient wounds, as if they had died many years ago. He realized the horrifying truth. These were the souls of all those who had ever disappeared in the Bermuda Triangle. They were stuck here, in a world where time had stopped, where eternal darkness reigned, and where invisible predators hunted the living. Wells began searching for an escape, but the further he went, the more horrific the things around him became. The ground breathed like a living organism, and from the fog emerged creatures that did not belong to our world. They had elongated arms, sharp teeth, and eyes that glowed in the dark. Among the wreckage of Gloria, he found an old ship's bell, and as soon as he struck it, the world shuddered. The ground beneath him trembled, and the ghosts around him screamed in agony. Darkness began to engulf everything, and he realized, if he didn't find an exit, he would become part of this cursed place. But what was this world? It was something far worse than just another dimension. It was a trap, a prison created for the souls of lost sailors. A place where they lived and died again and again, with no chance of escape. Wells felt as though something vast was watching him. It had no form, only a presence, terrifying, inescapable. And it was drawing closer. Captain Wells felt the darkness around him grow thicker, as though the night itself was pressing in from all sides. His heart beat like a hunted animal. From everywhere, eerie whispers filled the air. Voices of sailors who had vanished here centuries ago. They weren't begging for help. They were warning him, or perhaps mocking him. He moved forward among the wreckage of ships that seemed to belong to different eras. There was a rusted submarine, split in half, wooden frames of ancient sailing ships that appeared to have rotted here for centuries, and even a crashed airplane barely visible through the muck. All these vessels, all these people, they had ended up here. And now, he was one of them. Suddenly, from behind the wreckage came a sound. First quiet, like the rustle of wind, but it quickly grew into heavy, deep footsteps. Something was moving toward him. He turned around and felt the chill creep into his bones. Before him stood a creature, huge, grotesque, with long dried-out limbs and a face resembling a human skull covered in slime. It stared at him with empty eye sockets, and from its gaping mouth dripped a black liquid that hissed as it hit the ground. The captain tried to retreat, but his feet sank into the sand. Fear paralyzed his body as the creature opened its maw even wider, and from it came not a roar, not a growl, but a terrifying voice that sounded both like a whisper and a thunderclap. "You will stay here. Like all the others." The captain screamed and lunged forward, scrambling past the wreckage, but the creature didn't relent. He heard its bony fingers scraping everything around, moving through the darkness like a spider chasing its prey. He ran a few more meters, when suddenly the ground beneath him gave way. He fell into a black abyss and found himself in water. But it wasn't ordinary water. It was thick, like oil, cold, like death. He tried to swim, but something grabbed his leg and dragged him down. He screamed, gasping for air, but something deeper, something even more terrifying, swallowed him. And in the last moment, before he was to disappear into the abyss, he saw them. Thousands. Millions. Eyes, the eyes of those who had vanished in the Bermuda Triangle. They were everywhere. In the water, in the darkness, even within him. They were watching. They were waiting. And then he saw the most horrifying thing. In the very center of this nightmare, something moved. Large, shapeless, but alive. It wasn't just a monster. It was the curse of the triangle itself. The very thing that devoured ships, planes, and the souls of people. It was eternal, hungry, and now it wanted him. The darkness tightened around him, filling his lungs with cold. He heard voices, saw the faces of those who had been there before him, and in the final moment, he understood the terrible truth. There is no escape here. There is only eternity. And then the world went dark. The darkness consumed him, but Captain Wells did not die. He felt his body trapped in a viscous murk, pulsing like living flesh. His lungs filled with cold, and his heart seemed to beat not in his chest, but somewhere nearby, ripped from his body. He could not scream. He could not even think. But he could see. Before him stretched an endless world made of wreckage from sunken ships and human bones. The sky above him was not black, but blood-red and slow-moving gigantic silhouettes, resembling huge, decaying hands stretched downward. Their fingers scraped the air, trying to reach him. He looked down and felt his insides twist with terror. Beneath his feet were faces. Hundreds, thousands of dead faces, staring at him with lifeless eyes. Their mouths were agape in silent screams, their hands reaching for him, trying to grab him. These were the ones who had once entered the Bermuda Triangle and could never escape. They were still alive. Wells felt something touch his ankle. A hand. It had risen straight from the ground, from the face of one of the ghosts. It pulled him downward. The captain jerked, trying to break free, but from the darkness, other hands slowly emerged, like rotten tentacles, all reaching for him. He tried to scream again, but only a moan escaped his throat. His lips did not move. His face was no longer his own. He realized that he was changing. His arms grew longer, thinner. The skin on them split, revealing pale, almost transparent flesh. His legs disappeared, transforming into something sticky, shapeless. He was no longer human. He was becoming part of this world. Part of the curse. Suddenly, something massive passed by him. He felt it not with his eyes, but with something more. New nerves, new organs beginning to grow inside him. It was an incredibly large creature, gliding through this world like a whale in the depths of the ocean. It had no form, but its presence pressed on the mind. And then Captain Wells understood. It was death itself. Not just a monster. Not just a trap. It was an ancient terror that existed beyond time, beyond human understanding. It was the one that created the Bermuda Triangle. It was the one that gathered the souls of lost sailors and forced them to suffer here eternally. The creature stopped. It felt him. And then Captain Wells heard the voice. "You are no longer you. You are part of us." And in that moment, as the creature extended its shapeless tendrils toward him, he saw his reflection in the shards of an old mirror hanging among the wreckage of ships. It wasn't him. There was something else. His eyes were empty, his mouth torn open in a silent scream, and his skin was no longer human. He had become one of those he had feared. One of the cursed. One of the eternal inhabitants of this world. He wanted to scream, but instead of a voice, a quiet whisper escaped his mouth, the same one he had heard before. "You will stay here. Like all the others." And then Captain George Wells vanished. His name no longer existed. His soul was consumed. And the Bermuda Triangle awaited new victims. The darkness consumed Captain Wells. His mind was shattered. His body was no longer his. But he still existed. He felt himself stretching in all directions, his consciousness dissolving into a world that should not have existed. Something made him remember. He was back on the Gloria. He saw his sailors, heard the ocean's roar, felt the salt on his lips. But it was wrong. Because they were all dead. Their bodies were rotting, decaying, yet they still stood before him, smiling with their rotten jaws. "Captain," one of them whispered, stepping closer. His skin hung in tatters, his eyes were empty, but deep inside, a bluish glow flickered. "You've forgotten. You've always been here." He tried to step back, but his feet were rooted to the deck. The water slowly rose, flooding his boots, reaching his knees, his waist, his chest. The water was black, viscous, like blood. Then his sailors began sinking into it. But they weren't drowning. They were being pulled by something. Something hiding beneath the surface. And then he felt it. It was there. Beneath them. Beneath the ship. Beneath the water. The creature was so enormous that it had no form. It was deeper than the ocean, older than time, hungrier than oblivion itself. It was what ruled this world. And it had noticed him. The water suddenly began to boil, and human faces began to rise around him. They were dead, but their eyes still wept, still begged, still screamed. "You won't escape." The voice rang inside his skull. Low, deep, as if millions of voices whispered at once. And then the creature rose. The water parted, revealing the terrifying abyss. It was endless. And from it, hands began to crawl out. Thousands, millions of hands. They reached for him, grabbed him, tore at his flesh, but he could not die. His body tore apart, yet he still felt it, still lived. His soul screamed, but the voice was swallowed by this world. And then he saw it. Among all these victims, among all the dead, he saw himself. The real him. His double, or what he had once been. But that Wells just stood there and smiled. He reached out his hand. "Join us, Captain," he said in his own voice. And the darkness closed everything. There is no escape. There is no salvation. The Bermuda Triangle does not just destroy. It creates. It consumes. It adds new souls to its collection. And the sea continues to claim new ships. Darkness. Eternity. Emptiness. Captain Wells no longer had a body, but he existed. His shattered consciousness floated in the endless sea of horror, slowly forgetting who he had been. But something made him remember. His body reappeared, as if it had been sewn together from parts that didn't quite belong to him. His arms were longer than before. His skin was pale, almost translucent. He could see the thick black liquid pulsing beneath it. He stood on the deck of a ship, but it was not his ship. The vessel was old, peeling, covered with seaweed and something that resembled black meat. Its wooden deck shuddered like living flesh, and the sails were made of skin, human skin. People stood before him. They resembled his former crew, but their faces were not quite human. Their eyes were white, like milk, and their mouths were too wide, as if stretched in an eternal silent scream. "Captain." One of them spoke, a voice made up of thousands of voices at once. "We've been waiting for you." Wells didn't want to be there. He wanted to run, scream, escape this nightmare. But his legs wouldn't obey. Then he heard a noise. Somewhere far below the ship, something moved. Something large. Something ancient. It was coming closer. The water beneath the ship began to change. It became viscous, like black honey. In the depths, yellow eyes appeared. Hundreds, thousands. They stared at him. And then something rose from the water. It wasn't just one creature. It was them all. all those who had ever disappeared in the Bermuda Triangle. Their bodies had merged into one gigantic conglomerate of pain, death, and terror. Faces jutted from the mass of dark flesh, their hands reaching up, their mouths whispering endless pleas. "Take me away. Help me. Kill me." Wells fell to his knees, covering his head with his hands. It was too much. It was a terror with no limits, no meaning, no salvation. But then the ship began to sink. It was being pulled down by black tendrils that grew from the dark water. His crew didn't move, they just stared at him, their smiles widening, their eyes darkening. And then he understood. He was the last one who could still feel fear. They had left him for dessert. The water rose, touching his feet. It was cold, almost alive. It seeped through his skin, crawled through his veins, wrapping around his heart. He wanted to scream. He wanted to escape. But instead, he only smiled. Because now he knew what true terror was. And the Bermuda Triangle laughed. Because it would always be hungry. The ship was being dragged into the dark water, its wooden planks cracking, the sagging sails made of skin flapping like the torn wings of a dead creature. Captain Wells felt the light fading around him. But he did not sink. The water did not accept his body. It dissolved him, like ink in the abyss. His flesh was no longer a body. It flowed, dissolved, intertwining with others, with those who screamed in the darkness, those who had been here before. His consciousness did not vanish. It expanded. He began to see. He saw all those who had ever disappeared in the Bermuda Triangle. Sailors, pilots, travelers. Their faces were parts of a great body, writhing in the depths. Their voices were only echoes. And he saw it. The true master of this place. It was not just a monster. It was older than the sea, older than death itself. It was a shadow that had appeared before humans learned to fear the dark. Its eyes burned like dying stars, its formless body shifting, sprouting hands, faces, bones. It opened its mouth. And he heard, "You will not just stay here. You are part of me." The captain wanted to scream, but his mouth was no more. His body was gone. He was part of something bigger, boundless. He was the eyes of the monster. Its hands. Its voice. And when the next ship or plane disappears in the Bermuda Triangle, he will be the one to call them. He will be the one to whisper to them in the dark. He will be the one to open their eyes to the terror that never ends. And the sea will consume new victims. Forever. And so, as darkness once again envelopes you, we say goodbye, but not for long. Remember, the night is never truly safe. Subscribe so you don't miss the new horrors, and come back when it's time for new nightmares. Beware of the shadows, they are always near. Until next time.